Okay, let's talk about mixing our plaster. So I have my water, I have my sieve, just a regular, mesh sieve. And there's two different ways that we can go about mixing plaster. I personally prefer to do the mound method, but I'm going to do a combo of things right now. I have this on my digital scale, as well as, so I've actually weighed out the amount of water to plaster ratio beforehand. But I am going to apply the plaster the same way that I would normally do the mound method. So if you notice down at the bottom, you can see, so like mound method, you have to sift it in, which does take a little bit longer as opposed to just like dumping it in. But it also can like kind of reduce the bubbles. But you can see down at the very base that you can see the plaster starting to kind of build up. It's really nice to be able to do kind of your first time mixing plaster with a clear container so that you can actually see the level of plaster rise. The entire goal of this mound method is to make it so that it's slowly building a mound like the plaster, because when you put the plaster in, so there's no mixing, you don't get to mix it all. If you mix it, you muck up the whole thing. So we're allowing the plaster to build up from the base, and you know that you have the right amount of plaster when you have a mound that doesn't sink back down. So I want to show you what that looks like in this process. Now, you don't want to take too long in doing this process, because if you take too long, eventually, so plaster should normally set off in about 45 minutes fully hard. Okay, so that means that you should typically have about 10 minutes to get your 10 to 15 minutes to get your plaster in before you are going to start to run into some trouble. But even then, honestly, you can go a little bit faster. But you can see I'm about halfway filled with my plaster right now. Now, if you want to be smart about things, I also would recommend that you just put down a piece of newspaper, and then you can avoid all of this mess, because that just will make your life easier. Other things to note about plasters: you should have a bucket off to the side of just plain water, so that way when you are done, you are rinsing off your hands or your bucket or any of your tools in that bucket of water. Do not rinse this in your sink. You rinse this in your sink and you are going to clog up, harden, and cause yourself all sorts of problems in your plumbing. So do not wash any of this in your sink. You will have that rinse off bucket, and then in that rinse off bucket, you can, once you've rinsed everything off, you're going to let that sit for a couple of days, pour out the water, and then the plaster that is in there will have gone to the bottom and hardened. Either you can try to scrape that out, or it can just be a waste bucket that you throw away. Also, clean your materials right after you use them. So I'm going to use a little immersion mixer, and I have to clean that off right away afterwards, otherwise it is not going to be any good. You can see I'm starting to get a mound here, but it still kind of sinks down. There's some other areas that I need to add a little bit more plaster to. But your mound shouldn't really disappear and kind of float away if it's an island, because this really should be plaster is directly underneath your mound. So I'm very close. So now my island isn't going away. If you wait a few seconds and it doesn't go away, then you're doing good. And so now I'm using my immersion blender. You can just use your hand. You don't use your immersion blender if you plan on using, this is my ceramic immersion blender. Okay, don't use anything that you want to use with food. Okay. And you can just do this by hand. If you're doing it by hand, you want to make sure that you get your hand in there and kind of clean up. And it's okay, your hand can touch the plaster, but if your hands are sensitive at all, wear some gloves. It just dries your hands out pretty good. But the immersion blender is also working out all of these bubbles and stuff. So it's working all of those bubbles up to the top, which is a good deal. If you're doing it with your hand, make sure you just tap it on the table or something like that before you pour it into your mold. and make sure you get all of the chunks. And that should be good, okay? Time to pour.